Israel has been illegally occupying the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. That is something we hear frequently from some of the people who argue against Israel, although less and less since October 7th is this an issue of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But that is, when people point to the UN, the resolutions, and so on, that is what people are talking about. This is what the International Court of Justice will be talking about this Friday when they determine whether Israel is illegally occupying the West Bank. So today we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about the different aspects of this idea. We're going to be talking about, what it means, what jurisdiction is this under, and I'm joined by Marco and Richard, as I was yesterday and often am. But I'm also joined for the first time on the reality show by Adam Mossoff. We were on the Daily Objective together a few weeks ago. But for this show, Adam is an actual lawyer. Although I have said when it comes to international law, we're as much lawyers as anybody because international law is kind of bullshit. But I do like having an actual lawyer to confirm or object to what I'm saying. Look, the reason I say this is for me, some things are very clear. Like in a country, there are laws. You can be for them, you can be against them. You know what they are. If I rob a bank now, I know that is a crime and I will be punished. And it's very clear. I can look up in advance what the punishment is and then decide whether or not I want to do it. It's there's clarity. There's clarity in the law for the most part, whether it's good laws or bad. Here, uh, from my understanding, which again, Adam will tell me if I'm right or wrong, international law is this general idea from different treaties, different agreements, different UN resolutions, things that contradict each other, things that contradict the laws of the countries that sign up to them, things that countries don't sign up for, but maybe are somehow going to be held accountable. Adam, anything you want to pick up on from that rant?
Yeah, thanks, Razi. It's great to be on the program again, and it's really nice to be on the program with Marco and Richard as well. Hello, and just very quickly, first of all, you have to distinguish between kind of two different eras of international law. So there's international laws that first developed in the sense of international law from the Romans up through up through the 19th and early 20th century. This kind of what was referred to by Latin as jus gentium, the law of nations, it was largely known as. And that was just generally some norms that were agreed upon between countries about, where, trying to set some boundaries for deciding how treaties resolve conflicts, how land can be transferred after a conflict, and things of this sort. That is not modern international. So the international law that we are now working with now are a set of rules, as Razi mentioned, that were formulated in various treaties after World War II, the Geneva Convention in 1948, and it reflects different types of treaties and rules. So there's, for instance, the laws of armed conflict, which that's, by the way, where you see like references to proportionality and things of that sort, which kind of are some of the rules that kind of continue from the UN era. And then there's the human rights law. That's like Geneva Convention and things of this sort. And part of the fights that we see is kind of the fights as to which apply because they contradict each other. Because the laws of armed conflict are supposed to occur when there's a conflict, and that's not really supposed to be where you're looking to the human rights law. And by the way, I should have said this at the get-go. I'm not an expert per se on international law. I know this a little bit, largely through a lot of meetings and discussions with lawyers and ambassadors from a mission to Israel that I went on last week. But as Razi mentioned, it's law only in this kind of generic sense. It's contradictory, and in the post-World War II era, and we should, and I hope we'll get into this a little bit. But they went from international law as a way to end war to becoming international law as a source of endless wars. Because actually, if you really think about it, I mean, the rules that are now imposed upon countries by the international institutions, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and others, if you look at it, it would have been impossible for the US and the Allies to have won World War II. There would have been immediate actions and complaints brought against them by Germany and Japan and their client states and their supporters, just like there are today against Israel. It would have been impossible for the Allies to have won World War One, and we would have had we would have ended up in a stalemate situation with the Nazis and imperialist Japan still in power, and we would have been continually in conflict with them for decades and decades and decades. Just as we're seeing now with Israel and the Palestinians, who have exploited the contemporary international law to attack Israel in this exact same way.
Marco, Richard.
Okay, well, obviously we're not lawyers, but what I wanted to make my first intervention about was about education itself and how history is framed and taught, because I think that's a key element of how people are approaching this subject at the moment. And I think it's instructive to look at it that way. I have a relative who's just 16 years old, who's just done their first exam in history in the UK, an exam that kids across the country will have taken in every school at age 16. Now that focuses on 4 highly delimited areas of history. And it's very telling as to which ones they've chosen to get kids to focus on. It focuses on the Civil War in the US, where the key element to talk about is slavery. It focuses on South Africa, where the key element, the key word there is apartheid. It focuses on the rise of Hitler, and of course, where the key element is Nazism and wider term of nationalism. And it focuses on Russia just prior to communism starting. So you don't have to get into the nasty details of how many tens of millions died under communism. You can just talk about how terrible the world was in Russia just before it, and therefore why it was, in quotes, necessary to change the system. And of course, if kids then go on to further study of history, they will then cover a lot to do with the British Empire and colonialism and things viewed through that particular lens. Now, the fact that kids are taught these key words and this way of looking at the world means that they then interpret the events of today through the lens of those particular kind of terms, because that's really what they're being trained to do. They're being trained to put on glasses which already view things as oppressor and victim, as colonialist, or as anybody with a particular skin color or particular division in land will be deemed apartheid. So a lot of that stuff is what's going on at the moment, and I think a lot of that is what's being repeated endlessly on social media by the same people who are being trained as they go through the education system to look at the world this way and to basically realign everything according to this reframing narrative. And that's extremely dangerous, and that's what's leading us to this endless succession of waves of looking at things which we're seeing play out here with regards to Israel.
The legal push behind all this modern secular blood libel directed towards Israel is that it actually comes from the UN. The UN is the institution that was supposed to make every single country hold a hand in hand and skip towards sunlight in peace forever and ever again. When in fact the UN is just a collection of often dictatorships, Mickey Mouse countries, and countries which are currently involved in aggressive war, like Russia, for example. Russia, which is one of the 5 with a veto in the Security Council. So to assume that this very institution has got any interest in keeping the peace as such in the world is just laughable. So much so that this institution is a very institution that produces reports like the Francesca Albanese one about the occupation, which effectively says that Israel is a settler colonialism state is imposing the rule onto the poor Palestinians who so innocently take it and never complain about it. But the issue here is that the actual Arabs in the Middle East who live under a democratic state are the Arabs that live in Israel, and they totally ignore this fact. And ultimately it comes out to the to the conflict going on in the UN itself and in the world as a whole between civilization and the people who want to destroy freedom and the values that allow us to have this conversation, for example. So trying to stifle Israel, trying to come up with these made-up laws and made-up reports, an insinuation that Israel is the party that is committing illegal acts, is just part of the propaganda which has been going on since the 60s, at least, which is trying to destroy Israel from a legal point of view by making you think that Israel is the party here, which is the illegitimate state, illegal state, and this is dripping constantly coming through the culture. Just look at the creation of the various NGOs within the UN itself, like UNRWA, which is designed just to brainwash children in Israel and in the area where the Arabs are, and the NGO, which has the only purpose to continues this made up refugee status that has been carrying on for 75 years. So making sure that these people are always refugees, will always be refugees, because we don't want to put this issue to bed. And we want new generation to know that they've been oppressed by the nasty Israel. And therefore, at some point, we'll have to deal with Israel if we can't destroy them by constantly attacking them physically, we have an institution designed to wipe them out, in fact, to put them in a position where they cannot spread freedom and democracy in the Middle East.
Does UNRWA actually count as an NGO? Because I would think I mean, that would be a stretch. I mean,
sorry,
by...
one of the institution within the UN. The UN has got a plethora of
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, and UNRWA I think is the biggest, or at least one of the biggest, and best funded. Although people who saw the Daily Objective just before this show will have heard the cry that UNRWA is about to run out of money. So while I would like to see that, I kind of doubt it. Adam, you said at some point that it would have been impossible for the Allies to win World War II. With trying to fight the way Israel is expected to fight. And I'm thinking, yeah, it would have been impossible for Germany and Japan to win as well. But of course, it doesn't apply to them, which is the very problem with this. So I want to go to the point of illegal occupation, and I it was interesting to see when I just searched on Google illegal occupation and without adding anything to that. All the results are about Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. The first one is from, well, depending if you search on when I searched on my computer, it was Wikipedia. Then when I searched on my phone, it was the UN, and then Amnesty International and all these organizations. So with what we've said about international law, like what do you have to say about this idea of the occupation being illegal? Is it illegal? If so, by what law? And yeah, how should we address that? Adam.
We're all waiting to see who will answer your question first. Yeah, so in part, this has been a framework that has been driven by the filing or the request for an advisory opinion by the UN General Assembly back in 2022 before the International Court of Justice in regard to Israeli actions in the occupied Palestine. And that's actually, the action that refers to occupation. And in fact, it even uses legalese that sounds like apartheid as well to talk about Israel that Marco was just mentioning. And this is the decision that's going to be coming out very shortly, where it's expected that the advisory opinion will conclude, in fact, that Israel illegally occupies at least the West Bank, if not also Gaza. This is all just insane. And it shows you kind of how arbitrary and just to use a comic book reference, a bizarro world that exists in the international realm. So the Article 42 of the Hague Convention actually defines occupation. So this is 1948 convention, and effect and it essentially uses a concept of effective control. So if a country has occupation of another country, that country, the occupying country, has effective control over the other country. Now, this has been often spelled out through three subtests. Just to go, and the reason why I'm going through this too, because this is not real law, but this is how this has been treated. But to show you how it doesn't even apply to Israel right now. So the first one is, what we metaphorically refer to as boots on the ground. So you actually have an occupying force in the territory that you are occupying. Now, there is no occupying force in the West Bank. The IDF is not, on every corner of every street. And certainly after 2006, there was no occupying force in Gaza. Hamas is the elected government of Gaza. And in fact, to this day, even during the Gazan war, you have boots on the ground, but they're not in total control of the territory. And that goes to the second condition that is often set forth for effective control, which is the existing sovereign, the sovereign that is being occupied, loses the ability to apply authority. So Palestinian Authority runs the West Bank, and Hamas still effectively runs a massive portion of Gaza. In fact, Israel keeps having to refight battles in North Gaza because as they move through, Hamas has come back in and taken back over villages and towns and hospitals and started to use them as military bases and as sources of authority. And we see them stealing aid trucks all the time. They wouldn't be able to do that if they weren't exercising a sovereign type authority. Sovereign type authority means effectively being able to use coercion. And Hamas is using coercion in Gaza. And then the other is, and the third final subtest is that the occupying country has the ability itself to apply sovereign authority, which means the occupying country has the ability to be the sovereign in that sovereign country, right? So you have an occupying force. The original sovereign authority no longer has sovereign authority, and the occupier itself is exercising sovereign authority, which Israel doesn't do in the West Bank. That's the Palestinian Authority run by Abbas. And it still to this day doesn't do that in Gaza. And so even under, the strict terms of so-called international law, Israel is not occupying either the West Bank or Gaza. But that doesn't mean it's irrelevant because this is a so-called international law. And it's just a political tool to be used to attack countries that are good and that try to follow the norms of international law and are held accountable to those norms by other countries like the West and Europe and things of this sort. And there are entities who are not even countries themselves, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and others, and entities that don't care about international law, like Iran and Syria and Russia and China and North Korea, that don't care about this stuff, that just act however they wish to act. So this ends up being inherently a rigged and losing game for Israel. They can't win if they try to argue. And I met last week with the lawyer who is representing Israel right now before the ICC and the ICJ. And, and he really earnestly tries to engage with these issues, but it's very clear, and this is my own view, not his, that his name is Omri Sender, that, it's impossible for Israel to win this. And that's the whole point. This is, it's intended to be lawfare, which is a way of waging war by people who can't win a war. So then they go and file these actions. They attack the countries through these institutions, biased institutions at the UN, and win through other means, right? So international law, essentially, to take von Clausewitz's famous dictum and flip it on its head, right? International law essentially becomes war by other means.
Yeah, I've said in the past, I think the most impossible job in the world is Israeli ambassador to the UN, but maybe the person defending Israel in the ICJ is actually more impossible. Richard.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, and it's really crazy. So the ICJ, which often gets confused with the ICC, they're different institutions and sort of. See, the ICJ is where countries bring complaints against other countries, right? So, and currently we have, for instance, that's where South Africa has charged Israel with genocide. And sometimes you might wonder, like, well, why is it South Africa, which is a little weird? Why are they weighing in on this? Well, because the real instigator here is Iran. But Iran doesn't want to bring an action in the ICJ because Iran has never recognized the existence of Israel. And so for it to file a formal action in the ICJ against Israel means it's implicitly recognizing that Israel is a country, because that's the whole function of the ICJ. And we actually learned that actually, so how did South Africa become involved in this? Well, they were short on money. They couldn't even run an election that they needed to have. And an Iranian delegation visited South Africa. And then a week later, South Africa filed its action in the ICJ against Israel. And all of a sudden, South Africa had all this money to run their election that they didn't have before. So it's, once more, the head of the snake here, Iran, is the real source of all of this.
There's a term in Hebrew, goy Shabbat, or something like that, like a Sabbath Gentile. Basically, if you don't want to, turn on the light or do anything that you're supposedly forbidden from doing on the Sabbath, you have a Gentile to do it for you. I think that's this situation is kind of
Yeah.
the national version of it with for Islamists. Richard.
And this is the point about the international law, isn't it? This is about the point about how countries both use it, particularly the nefarious countries, use it and ignore it at will, and how that serves their ultimate agenda. And when you're looking at the term occupation, often it's accompanied by illegal occupation, and then often the illegal is dropped. So you're left with just the occupation, and it's that constant playing with language and the fusing of concepts, so that one is always, that both are always in your mind in every situation, which leads people to interpret things in the wrong manner. And of course, not only are we talking here about the precedent in a legal setting, but the precedent in terms of common parlance, in terms of how media represent things, how UN reports are written, how it's covered generally. That drip effect is definitely prevalent all the time. I think one of the things that's interesting about what you say, Adam, is the extent to which countries like Israel are sanctioning, suffering with the sanction of the victim by even, presenting a case at the ICJ, etc.
Yeah.
And the difficulty that presents from a PR perspective in terms of, do you submit just a written judgment, for example? Do you send representatives to argue, or do you just denounce the court entirely? And how do you then cover the dangerous PR effect, or the easy open goal which that allows your detractors to shoot for, given that you're no longer defending yourself in the way that you're supposedly defending yourself? Well, you are defending yourself militarily, and therefore that implies some sense of guilt, or that you don't have a defense. Because I think that's one of the hardest things to know what to do, because presumably we would all agree that some of these bodies shouldn't even exist. But they do exist, and they're not going to go anywhere. So what do? Set up alternative bodies? How should you approach that?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Richard. And we talked about this with them, because we learned that there was actually a significant debate within Israel, between the lawyers and within the government, about how to respond to especially the South Africa complaint at the ICJ, about whether to even appear. Because there were a lot of people who took the initial position you just described, to say we shouldn't even appear. Like this whole thing is a facade. It's rigged, and we shouldn't give it the consideration. Well, and they ultimately decided to do so, as it was explained to us, for a couple reasons. One was, so the South African action in particular, the occupation one as I said, it's an advisory opinion. It shows you how like loosey-goosey all of this is. It's not actually an action brought by another country. But so the South African one is, the one that charges Israel with genocide under the 1948 Geneva Convention. That's the only convention, by the way, in the international realm that Israel has agreed to. That Israel originally agreed to. In fact, originally Israel played a significant role in the development of that convention for obvious reasons. The Israelis who participated in the drafting of that convention in 1948 would be utterly rolling in their graves to see it now cynically being used in this lawfare attack on Israel itself. So it's the only one that they've agreed to. Now, why is that significant? Well, because they haven't agreed, for instance, to the Rome Convention that created the ICC. And one of their arguments at the ICC is, we never agreed to this convention. We don't have to show up. And so then if they didn't show up at the ICJ under the Geneva Convention, then that would undermine their whole argument about, well, if you just don't want to show up, right? It would be looking like they want their cake and eat it too, because here's an actual convention they did consent to, and they're still refusing to show up. So they realized they were kind of stuck, given their other earlier arguments about why they didn't have to even appear at the International Criminal Court for having never consented to the Rome Convention that created the International Criminal Court. So there was that issue. So they realized, if we want to continue to maintain our argument in the ICC that it doesn't have jurisdiction to issue arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Gallant, we have to show up here because we consented to this convention. But they also realized the point, Richard, I think that you also made, which is, and they said they realized that it was their chance to tell their story. That a lot of the effect of these institutions and the way they run is they define the narratives, the drip, drip, drip that you guys are talking about. They set the tone and the framework for how these things are talked about. These actions are why the genocide and occupation have come to dominate our language. If you go back 20 years ago, there wasn't that much reference outside to Israel's illegally occupying these, that wasn't, in fact, the language back then was, Israel can trade land for peace, right? That was the whole argument, which, by the way, implies like you're not illegally occupying it. This is an opportunity for you to give up something you actually have a legitimate right to own and to give up in exchange for a benefit. So they realized also, then Omri Sender kind of conveyed this to us, that this was our chance to tell our story, to get it out there, to create the alternative narrative. And now, and I appreciate that, but I think that ends up being too much of the sanction of the victim. And again, this is me talking, this is us talking as objectivists, right? Because the game is rigged against them. They can't, they can tell their story, but at the end of the day, it's not going to matter. They're still going to be, told on Friday that they illegally occupied the Palestinian lands and that they need to get out immediately. And that, by the way, that will trigger a whole slew of international repercussions. It will justify BDS. It'll justify trade sanctions. And by the way, right, and Israel cares about that because the countries that will be told they have to do this are its allies, right? England, Germany, France, United States. Whereas like Iran, Russia, like they're like, go ahead and sanction us. We don't care. So again, it just shows you that, that the title, the entirely uneven just irrational system that's set up here to punish good countries.
Marco.
Yeah, the system is designed to punish good country, and Israel in particular. It's so clear that when Russia invades Crimea in 2014, nobody talked about occupation. When China took over Hong Kong in 2020, nobody cared about occupation. And then you have this propaganda coming out from Gaza, and suddenly it's Israel on the wrong side. And let's also forget the fact that genocide was a concept introduced in law following the genocidal attempt of the Nazi to wipe out all the Jews in the land. They murdered over 6 million people during the Second War. And part of the genocide, of the definition of genocide, is the intent of wiping out the population. And you just have to look at the facts that Israel, if they wanted to wipe out the population of the Arab population, first of all, they wouldn't integrate them in the society in Israel itself. for a start. And second, within a few weeks, October 7th, they could have wiped out the whole of Gaza. They have the military capability to do it, but they chose not to do it because that's no intention. And that's why you have boots on the ground. And that's why you lost over 200 soldiers from the IDF trying to move very careful, not to minimize the casualties on the ground. And then again, all you had to observe about the occupation, well, if Israel had occupied Gaza, then they wouldn't have built hundreds of miles of tunnels under Gaza itself in order to hide their weapons and all their military capability in the first place. So even if you're an expert in law, just looking, observing, it will tell you that actually the occupation that doesn't allow. The Oslo Accord gave some areas of Judea and Samaria to the Palestinian Authority, which was created on purpose in order to manage some of those territory. And other territories are shared management between Israel and the Palestinians, so-called Palestinian. So all the arguments using a legislation designed to pretend that Israel is occupying territory when it's blatantly obvious it's not the case. How is it anything but malicious? It's clearly designed in order to stump Israel with an excuse.
Yeah, and I have to wonder if, again, with this, with signing something like the Oslo Accord, Israel is essentially, saying, yeah, actually, we're guilty, and therefore here's how we're going to remedy it, and of course, opens them up, as you mentioned, to other problems. And so, before I go to the next point, I want to ask you, Adam, because there's a comment by Mark in the chat. He says, "I don't understand why the UN does not recognize Israel's borders according to San Remo in the Cairo conference." I can tell you why the UN does not recognize it, but with San Remo, yeah, Israel would be what, from the sea to somewhere in Iraq, right? So can Israel go and say, look, this is where the Jewish state is supposed to be? It's international law, it's an agreement.
Yeah, it just goes to show you, the fights over I'm going to use the question to make another point, which is, you don't want to get into a fight about well, who was there first, right? This people get in these fights on Twitter all the time. Like, well, the Israelis were there 3,000 years ago, long before, and it's because any agreement, any period of time, in fact, is effectively an arbitrary choice. Right? So, the British Mandate in 1947, right? Or what about the 67, results, the following the 60, the aftermath of the 67 war when they had the Sinai, the entire Sinai Peninsula, right? So it's just, you don't want to get into those types of arguments about well, where can they, which agreement, which period of time is the appropriate period of time? A country is a country that exercises coercive force over a defined geographic area, and has the monopoly on the use of that force in that area. So it controls its borders. It has a military. It has a defense, has a police, right? And and through human history, countries have gotten into wars and have taken land as a result of that war and annexed it all the time. And that's what's happened repeatedly in these instances. By the way, Israel has never engaged in a war of conquest ever in its entire existence since 1948. What it has happened is it's been attacked repeatedly. War of Independence in 1948, when Palestine was offered land, right? There was the 1948 mandate for Israel through the UN had created two countries, Israel and Palestine, with respective land. And the result of that was Palestinians joined with Jordanians, Egyptians, Syrians, and everyone else and attacked Israel. And and so this by the way is what they refer to as the Nakba, right? Which is them starting a war and then losing the war and then complaining about the fact that they lost the war. And and you don't get to do that. You don't get to start a war, attack someone, and then complain about the results of what happens now that you've lost because you lost the war that you started. And this is the historical pattern. 67, 73, it just continually again and again and again with Israel. They are attacked, they defend themselves, push back the invaders, and push out from Israel into the invading territories to prevent those invading territories from attacking them again. And they claim, and then they have that land, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza, Sinai. My attitude has always been Israel should have just kept those lands. And that would have been the end of it. I mean, they would still be in the same position they are now. They would still be attacked. They would still be criticized. There would be nothing different except the fact that they would be a larger country with more land, with more space, so that if a country attacked them, they wouldn't be they wouldn't be able to shoot rockets to Tel Aviv or to Jerusalem.
Yeah, I agree with that. Even by the way, as a leftist kid who, supported giving whatever is necessary, the land for peace thing always I didn't understand it because, like you mentioned, it recognized that Israel has this land to give as a benefit, and getting peace as a isn't peace a mutual benefit? That was kind of the question in my mind, but. Anyway, thank you, Christopher, for the super chat. Thank you, Jonathan Honig. Jonathan says, thanks to Adam for being such a loud moral voice on this issue.
Thank
Richard.
you, Jen.
Yeah, and I think the principle you were talking about there, Adam, also applies to post-October the 7th, doesn't it? When the same sort of mini Nakba narrative is written into things as, we started this, but oh no, we're the victims again. You're seeing that
exactly.
for sure.
Exact same.
Yeah. And what you were saying earlier in terms of Israel presenting its course and getting a chance to tell its own side of the story, that strikes me as the same principle that's used endlessly in terms of all sorts of media settings when somebody is invited to come on and tell their side of the story as if they're going to be given a fair hearing, when all they're going to do is they're going to be pummeled with the existing agenda that was already there, even if they didn't show up. And of course, at the same time, by presenting two sides of the story, you're opening the door to that moral equivalence, which suggests that every story has two sides and they're equally valid. But of course, when it comes to the UN and stuff like that, we're the courts and things, we're talking about somebody then making a judgment at the end of it, which says your side of the story is not valid, not relevant, and of course, all the media headlines then result from that judgment. However illegitimate that court is, however illegitimate its findings are, however dubious the reasons for which its judgment has been made. And I think when we're talking about what will follow from any of this, the fact that it will legitimize the ability to economically essentially attack Israel with the BDS movement, making it a policy for governments all over the place to institute economic sanctions, making anti-Semitism a legitimized policy as a result of the stamp of a central court on a document. That is the real problem here, isn't it? That's the real danger coming ahead, because that is not only an attack on Israel, it blurs that area where it's also an attack on capitalism. It's an attack on success. It's an attack on the freedom of people to control their own lives, make their own money, and what Israel represents from a wider perspective in terms of its position on the world stage and how it runs its country for its own people.
Yeah, beautifully said, Richard.
The thrust behind the UN is often, as they often mention, is the Palestinian exercise of their right to self-determination, totally evading the fact that an entity which does only wants to destroy the Jews, because ultimately, the same as Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, they make it quite clear in their founding document that all they want to do is destroy Israel and making sure no Jews are found anywhere in the Middle East. And then, eventually move the target towards the West, because being funded by Iran, the West is always America, the great devil. And every person who's not a Muslim effectively is seen as either somebody to convert or somebody to destroy. And so this is the kind of mentality that makes possible the start of the war from 48. As soon as Israel declared its independence, they couldn't possibly even contemplate the idea. And despite the fact that the UN partition had two states, as you mentioned, Adam, that wasn't good enough. Even the fact that they would have had more land that they have now, it wasn't good enough. And they never wanted a two-state solution. They wanted a one-state solution, a big caliphate, a big Islamic institution that goes from the Mediterranean all the way to India, possibly. So that's never been an issue. And as Ayn Rand makes the point, evil is parasitic on the good. And that's why these Hamas, this institution, these jihadi people, all they need to do just buy a bit of time to regroup, to set aside a few more weapons, make sure that they get more weapons from Iran via Egypt, via the usual routes, and then being able to continue this war. The same reason why their people are bred for martyrdom. All this kind of behavior, which has been going on since 48, really. It's been repeated over and over across a generation. But the UN pretends that by following the legal procedures and the various appeals and the hearings and the trials, all this kind of stuff, only buys time for Hamas to make sure that they regroup, they manage to regenerate and continue this thing forever.
Tom, thank you. Tom has been a member for 24 months. Whenever we get these messages that highlight how long a member has been on, first of all, it reminds me of how long we've had YouTube memberships, which is nice. It also reminds me that one of the benefits you get as a YouTube member is having a super chat like highlighted message once a month, plus hours of additional content every week, plus emojis. I don't know if the Marco and Richard emoji is available yet or the Razi emoji, but those are coming soon. And Tom's message starts with more Adam, please. As far as I'm concerned, we'll have Adam on so frequently that the Adam emoji will also be a membership benefit soon. So Tom says, more Adam, please, and resources on Israel history and international law. No peace treaty results in a military government being set up in the occupied land. Yeah, so first of all, in terms of doing episodes like this, they do often require more research, although having Adam on kind of made that not necessary for us. I want to ask you, Adam, about this idea of self-determination that we hear about a lot. First of all, when I hear the word self in relation to a collective, that bothers me already. But yeah, what can you tell us about this idea in terms of any legal standing that it has for a group of people?
I don't, so unfortunately, I don't know that area of international law. As I mentioned, I'm not an expert. I haven't been studying it for a very long time. I only know it largely in the context of the current conflict and the frameworks of the laws that have been applied in the current conflict, going back at least a little bit. But the concept of self-determination is widespread within international law and within the rhetoric of international law for a very long time. Oh, people have a right to determine themselves and what they do. Well, guess what? Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2006, completely withdrew, and the Gazans engaged in an act of self-determination and voted Hamas into power. That was their act of self-determination. And what does their self-determination tell us? Well, exactly what Marco said. Hamas is dedicated to the genocidal destruction of all Jews, not just Israel, but Jews. And in fact, one of the Hamas leaders just like yesterday called on all Palestinians around the world to start attacking Jews around the world. He said, it's time for you to stop not acting, and you need to start acting. You can attack Jews everywhere you live. It is truly a genocidal movement. And which shows the total lie and charade of accusing the war in Gaza with the collateral civilian deaths as a result of the use of civilian shields by Hamas as, that so-called genocide. People have no idea what genocide is. And what genocide is what happened on October 7th. I visited Israel, went to those sites. This is not about land. This is about genocide. And so this is the problem with this notion of self-determination. It's the same problem with the notion of democracy. Like, oh, as long as people have the right to vote, everything's great, right? This was the problem with the neoconservatives in the United States when they said, well, we'll go and we'll spread democracy by invading Iraq and all these countries, and we'll show them the benefits of this. Well, they gave them democracy, and the people voted themselves back into tyrannies. And just like the Gazans voted Hamas into power, and Hamas is the government of Gaza. I always emphasize that when I talk to people. People refer to it as a terrorist organization. It is not a terrorist organization. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. The Houthis are a terrorist organization. Hamas is the government of Gaza. It has had sovereign authority over Gaza since 2006. And so this is, this idea of self-determination is just, it's such an invalid concept from the get-go, because it encompasses if someone wants to vote themselves into tyranny, if someone wants to vote genocide of another people, that's their self-determination. We have to respect it. It's an irrational concept from the beginning, and I think we should just move off of it. The reason why we have representative governments, why there are Republican forms of governments, not in the party sense in the United States, but in the sense of a representative government, is that so that the people can be sure that they have that if the government starts to not protect their rights, they don't have to commit violence and revolution. They can vote those politicians out of office and replace them with the politicians that will respect their rights. But the foundation is free society, rights, the types of, the ideals and aspirations of Western civilization that Richard very beautifully kind of summarized earlier, that I'm not repeating here because he did it so much better than me.
By the way, I will remind people the election that Hamas won, the second party was Fatah, which is also a party that wants to eliminate the Jews, is totalitarian. They want to replace Israel with a totalitarian state, not as theocratic, a bit more fascist, but still not good guys. So yeah, the Palestinian people are very much united around this cause, even if they have some disagreements internally. Richard.
Yeah, and I think one of the points you touched on there was in terms of talking about people as collectives all the time, and not focusing on the individuals. The fact they have their own volition, they make their own choices. Now, obviously, that refers to each individual everywhere, including in Gaza. But I'm also thinking about the people who choose of their own volition to move to Judea and Samaria as Israelis, and the fact that this is often framed as if they've been coerced by their own government to move to a set area when they've chosen to, but for their own lives, their own choices, whether that's their ideology, whether that's religious beliefs, whether that's just where they want to live within the country, and a lot of that is all badged together. I think that's certainly one of the dangers in how things are framed here, and not recognizing the relevance of the individual as being paramount.
Marco, anything to add?
Yeah, Razi, you were talking about the Palestinian people and the relevance. I mean, so I toured kibbutz near Oz, which is still completely destroyed, and a resident of the kibbutz gave us the tour, and she was describing October 7th, and that there actually were three waves of attacks on October 7th. The first wave was Hamas commandos, the elites. The second wave was the regular Hamas soldiers. The third wave was the Gazan civilians. There were about 3,000 Hamas soldiers who attacked their total on October 7th. There were untold thousands of civilians. And as a kind of an offhand remark that she made at one point, she said, and the people in the wave that we feared the most were the civilians who came to pillage, loot, murder. I mean, yeah, the idea that there's some type of disjunct between the Palestinian population in Gaza who are upset that the people that they support also commit tyrannical acts against them, so they want their cake and eat it too, don't all fundamentally support Hamas and what it's doing in its mission, in its genocidal mission is just fantasy, because it does. They do.
Yeah, we've talked about this on this channel, and it has been controversial even among objectivists. The first video on this channel that got a lot more views than we were getting before was titled "The Palestinian People Are the Enemy," and we mentioned the fact that there was that wave of thousands of civilians that went to Israel when they could and did whatever they could, and then there were the people who maybe weren't brave enough to do that, but were celebrating in the streets. And then there are the people who we know hostages are held by families. What we don't hear much of is the people who say this is not okay. We should not be slaughtering Jews. That is something that we are told is kind of exists, but we haven't been given any specifics. Thank you, John Wass, for the super chat. Thank you, Tron, for the super chat. Tron says, secondary issue is they conflate any occupation as illegal, which is not the case. I mean, even more than that, I've been in recent weeks, I've been binging on North Korea videos, and one of the recent ones showed that there was I think a 10-day mourning period for one of the two leaders who's no longer with us. And one of the laws that they have is that you're not allowed to laugh during that time. That's the law. It is actually illegal. Just because something is illegal doesn't mean it's not right, and that law shouldn't change. So yeah, there is the question of what does this idea of the illegal occupation mean? But then there is the question of, is this the right thing to do or not? One other thing I want to ask you about is, I mean, again, this is kind of it rests on the assumption that there is an illegal occupation and it's also immoral and everything, but we hear that there's the right to resist. And of course, when they say resist, they this is often used as a justification, even for things like October 7th. What are your thoughts on that, Adam?
Well, I have very strong opinions on this. I mean, I have never seen this concept of a right to resist used outside of as a rationalization and justification for horrific atrocities and horrific acts of violence against innocent people, whether it's suicide bombings, whether it's October 7th, and um, and again, it shows you kind of how people who embrace and justify evil, exploit language, exploit concepts to try to rationalize and hide the true evil. So here, of course, what they're similarly, somewhat trying to invoke is this idea of the right of revolution that's talked about in the Declaration of Independence, right? When a government becomes tyrannical, is the obligation, it's the right of the people to revolt and to change the government. And so they're trying to key into, they've created this concept of a right of resistance to key into this notion of the right of rebellion that was used by the founders and has long been recognized as a justification for overthrowing tyrannical governments. But that's not what they mean when they say right of resistance. I mean, and as exemplified, Razi, by what you just, by the phrase that we often hear, which is, all things are justified by those who are oppressed and have the right of resistance. And it's why people are now going around with placards saying, rape is not resistance. Because it's a horrific rationalization for evil. And whenever I now on Twitter, I just have a rule now, whenever one of these people who pro-Hamas people try to gaslight me, oh, what about the genocide and in Israel? My immediate response is, well, if you're willing to condemn the genocide that occurred, the act of genocide that occurred on October 7th, we can have a conversation. If you're willing to condemn, mass rape and murder and the continued, by the way, war crime of taking hostages, we can have a conversation. And they never do. because they don't view that as illegitimate. They don't view those as war crimes or as improper actions. And then you're dealing with just an evil person and you don't need to have a chat with them.
Well, you're more generous than I am. If anybody claims that Israel is committing genocide, that's the end of the conversation for me because like you said, they never want to follow up when you want them to condemn what their side does. And
Well, I do that more for my readers. I do that more so people can see them
Yeah.
and what they're doing. Yeah, I'm not trying to change their mind, but the people who are seeing my tweets and their tweet, right, who might be confused by what's going on, who don't know, right, what's really happening, they can then see consistently like what's really going on.
Thank you, PC, for the super chat. PC says, I marched in November for a boy kidnapped from Nir Oz carrying his picture. He's free now. His dad is not. I won't name him for privacy. Look, we're talking about this a lot and we'll continue to talk about this, but 9 months on, many of the hostages have not been released. Hamas has not been defeated. Hopefully something will change. We have said in recent days the killing of Muhammad Def has been done in a way that's a bit more positive from what we've seen from Israel in the past. They heard where he is. They dropped 8 tons of bombs on him. That's not usual for Israel, but that is how you win a war. Marco, Richard, any parting thoughts?
Only what the outcome of all of this is really is the fact that all of this appeasement and concession to evil and where it's led us across these 9 months, the fact that it's led to so many IDF soldiers dying unnecessarily, the fact that it's led to it being prolonged, the entire war being prolonged as a result, and the fact that these concessions, whether they're to the ICJ, whether to the ICC, whether to international opinion, or whether in terms of how the military operation is itself run, and of course the impact, of course, on ordinary people within Israel, including all of those people who are conscripted and whose conscription is now likely to go up to 3 years. All of that is some of the knock-on effects of this, and not being really morally clear on what the right thing to do is and how quickly it must be done in order not to make the good suffer.
Yeah, and the fact we shroud legislation around a bunch of bullies that hide in the UN and pretend to be playing by the rule, actually all it does hides a bunch of anti-Semites who only wants to perpetrate the destruction and the horrors that we have seen in the past. And the fact that they make it look like legislation, like law, that follow due process, that doesn't deny what they're doing. These are anti-Semites, and we have to, address them for what they are.
And quickly, where can people find more from you, Marco and Richard?
You can find more for us on the sister channel to this, Briefly Objective, which includes videos such as There Is No Arab Land from Harry Binswanger, or a recent one by Peter Schwartz on self-determination and debunking the notion. So please check that out.
And Adam, parting thoughts, and where can people find more from you?
I'm not written on international law on these issues, but I am commenting on these issues on Twitter very actively at Adam Mossoff. That's my handle, is my name, and trying to engage more broadly in other venues, especially after the mission that I went on to Israel with some other law professors last week. But I have nothing substantive to add beyond what both Marco and Richard said. They both said it very nicely and beautifully and eloquently. So I think on a substantive terms, I think that's the best note to end on.
Well, I share the view of many of the viewers that one of these venues where you comment about this more will be the Ayn Rand Center UK YouTube channel. That's also where you can find me, and you can also find me on Twitter at Razi Ginsburg. The Fountainhead, the Atlas Shrugged. It's only been a couple of months since we wrapped up the Fountainhead Book Club. So the Atlas Shrugged book, at some point I'll remember that we're now doing the Atlas Shrugged Book Club. That starts right after this show for members and YouTube members. If you become a member or a YouTube member right now, you can join this session live. If not, there are recordings of all of them. Thanks, guys, for joining. Thanks, everybody, for watching. And we'll be back with the Daily Objective and the reality show tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye-bye.